Friends, there is a prayer so simple, so direct, and so immediate in its action that most people overlook it entirely. They search for words, affirmations, rituals, and methods, believing that power lies in repetition or intensity. Yet the prayer that dissolves any problem does not rely on words at all. It does not persuade, convince, or command. It reveals. It uncovers what has always been present beneath the noise of fear, effort, and personal struggle. Most problems remain because they are fought. They are analyzed, resisted, managed, and carried as personal burdens. In that very process, they are granted reality, substance, and authority. The moment one believes a problem has power, that belief gives it life. The prayer that dissolves problems does not confront them directly. It does not argue with appearances or attempt to fix outcomes. It withdraws belief from the appearance altogether and rests in a deeper awareness where the problem cannot exist. This prayer begins with the quiet acknowledgement that there is a presence, an intelligence, a life that governs all things harmoniously. Not as a belief, not as a hopeful idea, but as a conscious turning away from personal control into spiritual awareness. When this turning happens, something extraordinary occurs. The mind stops projecting solutions and becomes still enough to perceive what is already complete. The instant nature of this prayer lies in its surrender. When the personal sense of, "I must fix this," falls away, the burden collapses with it. Problems do not dissolve because they are attacked, but because the one who was carrying them steps aside. In that stepping aside, the false sense of separation dissolves, and with it goes the condition that depended on that separation for its existence. This prayer does not ask for healing, supply, peace, or guidance. It recognizes that these are already present within the infinite order of being. The moment you stop asking life to give you something and instead become still enough to witness life expressing itself, the illusion of lack disappears. What seemed like a problem was only the mind insisting on managing what was never meant to be managed personally. Many fear this prayer because it feels like doing nothing. The world teaches effort, control, and strategy. This prayer teaches trust, not trust in future outcomes, but trust in present reality. It is the willingness to rest in the awareness that there is a wisdom functioning beyond human thought, a law of harmony that has never failed and never will. In this prayer, one does not say, "Remove this problem from me." One rests in the awareness, there is only divine order here. That awareness is not spoken outwardly, but felt inwardly. And in that feeling, the problem loses its foundation. Fear has no anchor, confusion has no ground, lack has no context in which to survive. The power of this prayer is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It quietly dissolves the tension that held the problem together. Sometimes the outer condition changes quickly. Sometimes it fades naturally as understanding deepens. But always something essential shifts. The inner burden lifts. The sense of struggle releases. Peace appears not as a reward, but as a recognition of what was always there. This is why this prayer works instantly. It does not operate in time. It does not wait for circumstances to improve. It moves awareness out of the realm where problems exist and into the consciousness where harmony is the only reality. And in that consciousness, problems have no language, no substance, no life. When this prayer becomes a way of being rather than an occasional practice, life changes without effort. Challenges may arise, but they no longer define experience. They pass through awareness without leaving a mark. What remains is a quiet confidence, a gentle assurance that nothing real can be threatened and nothing unreal has power. This is the one prayer. Not spoken, not repeated, not performed. Simply lived one. True prayer is not asking for change in conditions but awakening to an unchanging divine reality, and this understanding reverses almost everything the human mind has been taught about prayer. Most people approach prayer as a request sent from a limited individual to a distant power, hoping that circumstances will improve, pain will lessen, or situations will rearrange themselves into something more comfortable. In this approach, prayer becomes a transaction, built on the assumption that life is broken and must be fixed. Yet the deeper nature of prayer reveals that the outer condition is never the cause of distress. It is the perception of separation that creates the experience of lack, conflict, or fear. When prayer is understood as awakening, attention shifts away from appearances and returns to what is eternally whole. Conditions are always temporary, always shifting, and always subject to interpretation by the mind. If prayer attempts to change conditions directly, it remains trapped in the same level of thought that produced the problem. Awakening prayer does not argue with appearances or demand outcomes. It recognizes that beneath every appearance exists an unchanging reality that is complete, harmonious, and self-sustaining. This recognition does not deny human experience, but places it in its proper position as secondary to spiritual truth. The moment prayer becomes awakening rather than asking, effort falls away. There is no longer a sense of pleading or striving to reach something outside oneself. Instead, there is a quiet inward turning, a resting in awareness where the false sense of personal power and personal responsibility dissolves. In this stillness, the mind ceases projecting future scenarios and stops reliving past wounds. What remains is a simple awareness of being, untouched by conditions and unaffected by circumstances. Problems persist because they are continually energized by attention and belief. Asking for change reinforces the belief that the problem has authority. Awakening withdraws belief from the problem entirely. When consciousness rests in unchanging reality, conditions lose their claim to permanence and power. They are seen as temporary expressions rather than defining truths. This shift is not intellectual, it is experiential. It is felt as relief, spaciousness, and a quiet confidence that does not depend on outcomes. True prayer does not seek to improve life, it reveals life as already whole. From this revelation, changes may occur naturally, but they are effects rather than goals. Healing, guidance, and resolution flow as expressions of alignment, not as rewards for effort. The one who prays no longer stands apart from what is sought. There is no longer a gap between the seeker and the source, because awakening reveals that the source has never been absent. In this understanding, prayer becomes a state of awareness rather than an activity. It is the conscious surrender of false perceptions and the gentle acceptance of what eternally is. Conditions may rise and fall, but the unchanging reality remains untouched, and awareness rooted there no longer reacts to appearances as threats or obstacles too. The instant dissolution of problems occurs through inner stillness, not mental effort, because effort belongs to the same restless thinking that creates and sustains the sense of conflict. The human mind is trained to solve, analyze, compare, and predict, and when a problem appears, it immediately begins constructing strategies to overcome it. While this may work for mechanical tasks, it fails in the deeper realms of fear, lack, and emotional or spiritual distress. Mental effort assumes that the problem is real, powerful, and personal, and every attempt to fix it reinforces those assumptions. Inner stillness is not the absence of thought achieved through force, nor is it a trance or withdrawal from life. It is the natural quiet that emerges when the mind stops trying to control outcomes. In this stillness, attention is no longer scattered among possibilities, worries, and imagined futures. Awareness settles into the present moment, where the problem has no momentum. Most problems exist almost entirely in anticipation or memory, fueled by what might happen or what once did. Stillness collapses this timeline and brings awareness back to what is actually happening now. When the mind becomes still, it stops feeding the problem with emotional energy. Fear, resistance, and overthinking act like fuel, keeping difficulties alive long after their practical relevance has passed. Inner stillness withdraws that fuel. Without resistance, the problem loses structure. Without fear, it loses urgency. Without constant analysis, it loses definition. What once seemed solid begins to feel thin and unstable, eventually dissolving under the weight of its own unreality. Mental effort tries to impose order from the outside, but stillness allows order to reveal itself from within. There is an intelligence operating beyond personal thought that naturally restores balance when it is not obstructed. This intelligence does not respond to pressure or anxiety. It becomes evident only in quiet receptivity. In stillness, intuitive insights arise without being forced. Decisions clarify themselves. Actions become simple and appropriate rather than frantic or excessive. The reason stillness works instantly is that it removes the inner conflict that mirrors the outer one. A problem continues as long as there is a divided consciousness struggling against it. When inner struggle ends, the problem no longer has a counterpart within awareness to reflect itself through. This does not mean that outer circumstances always vanish immediately, but their emotional grip dissolves at once. The sense of being threatened, overwhelmed, or trapped disappears, and with it goes the problem's power to dominate experience. Stillness also reveals that many problems were never external to begin with. They were interpretations layered over neutral events. When interpretation stops, reality appears simpler and less hostile. What remains is a calm presence that does not need to be defended or justified. From that presence, life unfolds with less friction, fewer complications, and a natural sense of trust that replaces the habit of constant mental interference. 3. Prayer is a recognition of what already is, not a request for what is missing, and this understanding transforms prayer from an act of hoping into an act of seeing. When prayer is treated as a request, it begins with the assumption that something essential is absent, delayed, or withheld. The mind looks outward or upward for fulfillment, placing wholeness somewhere in the future. This approach keeps awareness locked in a state of lack, because whatever is sought is mentally positioned as unavailable in the present moment. Recognition operates differently. It does not search or ask, it acknowledges. In recognition, attention turns away from appearances and rests in the awareness that life, intelligence, and harmony are already fully present. This does not mean that human needs are ignored, but that they are no longer treated as evidence of deficiency. Instead, they are understood as invitations to deepen awareness of the source from which all fulfillment naturally flows. When prayer becomes recognition, there is a subtle but powerful shift in consciousness. The one who prays is no longer a seeker trying to reach something distant. The sense of separation between the individual and the divine dissolves. What remains is an awareness of unity where supply, guidance, peace, and healing are seen as inherent qualities of being rather than rewards granted after sufficient asking. In this awareness, there is nothing to demand and nothing to wait for. Requests are rooted in time. They assume that fulfillment will come later, after conditions change or after enough effort is applied. Recognition exists outside of time. It reveals that what is real has always been complete. Even when outer circumstances appear unresolved, the inner recognition of completeness brings immediate relief. The problem loses its emotional charge because it no longer defines identity or worth. One can face situations without fear because they are no longer seen as sources of life or security. This kind of prayer does not attempt to persuade a higher power to act. It simply aligns awareness with what is eternally true. In that alignment, false beliefs dissolve naturally. Lack fades when abundance is recognized as a quality of being. Confusion fades when intelligence is acknowledged as ever present. Fear fades when the presence of life itself is felt rather than theorized. These changes occur without effort because recognition does not create anything, it uncovers what was always there. Recognition also brings humility, not in the sense of self-denial, but in the release of personal control. The individual no longer claims authorship over outcomes. There is a quiet trust that life knows how to express itself more intelligently than personal planning ever could. Actions still occur, but they arise from clarity rather than desperation. As prayer deepens into recognition, life is no longer divided into spiritual moments and ordinary moments. Every experience becomes an opportunity to notice what already is. The need to constantly pray about problems disappears because awareness itself becomes prayer. In this state, Peace is not dependent on resolution, and gratitude arises not from improvement but from realization. What once felt missing is revealed as having never been absent at all. 4. Human will and personal thinking must yield for spiritual awareness to operate, because the constant assertion of personal control blocks the perception of a higher order already in motion. The human mind is conditioned to believe that survival, success, and safety depend on its ability to plan, decide, and manage every detail of life. When difficulties arise, this conditioning intensifies, producing more thinking, more effort, and more emotional pressure. Yet this very activity keeps awareness confined to a limited perspective, unable to perceive solutions that lie beyond personal reasoning. Yielding does not mean becoming passive, careless, or indifferent. It is an inner release of the belief that personal thought is the source of wisdom. When human will dominates, prayer becomes a form of negotiation, subtly attempting to direct outcomes in preferred directions. Spiritual awareness cannot function within that framework because it does not respond to force or insistence. It becomes evident only when the mind relaxes its grip and allows space for a deeper intelligence to be felt. Personal thinking operates through comparison, memory, and prediction. It draws conclusions based on past experiences and imagined futures, often projecting fear where none exists. Spiritual awareness, by contrast, functions in the present moment. It is not bound by history or limited by expectation. When human will yields, awareness shifts from mental activity to direct perception. There is a sense of listening rather than directing, receiving rather than demanding. In this receptive state, insight arises naturally, often in ways the thinking mind could never have produced. Many resist yielding because it feels like loss of identity or control. The ego fears becoming irrelevant, yet what is actually relinquished is not intelligence, but anxiety. What falls away is not responsibility, but strain. As the pressure to figure everything out dissolves, a quiet confidence emerges. Decisions still occur, but they are simpler and more precise, guided by an inner clarity rather than mental noise. Spiritual awareness does not operate alongside human will, it replaces it. As long as the mind insists on being in charge, awareness remains secondary, faint, and easily ignored. When will yields, awareness becomes primary, shaping perception and response. This is why true prayer often begins with silence. Silence is the language of yielding. It signals the end of mental argument and the beginning of inner alignment. In yielding, the sense of separation between the individual and the source of wisdom diminishes. Life no longer feels like a series of battles to be won or avoided. There is an underlying sense of order, even when circumstances are unclear. This does not guarantee comfort or predictability, but it does guarantee coherence. Experience begins to make sense from within rather than being forced into meaning from the outside. As yielding becomes habitual, personal thinking loses its dominance. It still functions where appropriate, but it no longer governs identity or direction. Awareness becomes the guiding principle, quietly informing action without drama or strain. Problems that once seemed overwhelming lose their urgency, not because they are ignored, but because they are no longer being handled from a fragmented sense of self. In that shift, life unfolds with less resistance, and the unseen intelligence that was always present is finally allowed to do its work. 5. Problems persist only as long as they are believed to have power or reality, because belief is the substance that gives them weight, duration, and emotional impact. A problem by itself is often nothing more than a neutral circumstance or a passing condition, but when the mind labels it as dangerous, threatening, or permanent, it becomes charged with meaning. That charge is what transforms an event into a problem. Without belief, the situation remains simply what it is, free of the fear and resistance that give it dominance over experience. Belief operates quietly and habitually. It is rarely questioned because it feels natural and logical. When a difficulty appears, the mind immediately assigns it authority, assuming it can harm, limit, or define the future. This assumption is seldom examined. Once accepted, it shapes perception, emotion, and behavior. Fear intensifies attention, attention reinforces belief, and belief strengthens the problem's apparent reality. This cycle continues until it feels undeniable, even though its foundation rests entirely on unexamined thought. The power attributed to problems is not inherent, it is borrowed. It is borrowed from consciousness itself. Awareness, when focused through belief, gives form to experience. When awareness withdraws belief, the form collapses. This does not require denial or suppression. It requires clarity. Seeing that a problem has no independent authority loosens its grip immediately. What once felt solid begins to appear temporary and unstable. Many attempt to overcome problems by confronting them directly, but confrontation often reinforces belief in their power. Fighting a problem confirms that it is real and dangerous. Understanding dissolves it. When awareness recognizes that a problem cannot define identity, worth, or life itself, fear subsides. Without fear, the problem loses its primary fuel. What remains is a situation that can be addressed calmly or allowed to resolve naturally. Belief also ties problems to time. A believed problem extends into the future, creating anticipation and anxiety. It also reaches into the past, drawing on memory to justify fear. When belief loosens, the problem is brought back into the present moment, where it rarely has the magnitude the mind assigned to it. In the present, many problems reveal themselves as manageable or irrelevant. The dissolution of belief does not eliminate responsibility or action. It changes the quality of action. Instead of reacting from fear, action arises from clarity. Decisions become simpler because they are no longer driven by urgency or panic. Sometimes the outer condition changes quickly, sometimes it fades gradually. In either case, its psychological hold is broken. As this understanding deepens, life is no longer experienced as a series of threats. Challenges may arise, but they are not personalized. They are seen as passing forms rather than defining realities. The sense of being a victim of circumstances dissolves, replaced by a quiet stability that does not depend on external control. In that stability, problems lose their power to dominate experience because the belief that once sustained them is no longer present. 6. The one prayer works by dissolving the sense of separation between oneself and the source, because separation is the root illusion from which all problems arise. When life is experienced as divided into me and that which must help me, prayer becomes an attempt to bridge a gap that feels painfully real. From this sense of distance come fear, effort, pleading, and the belief that support must arrive from somewhere outside. As long as this division is accepted as true, prayer remains strained and problems appear powerful. Separation is not an actual condition but a perception created by identification with personal thought. The moment identity is confined to the body, the past and the personal story, the source appears external, distant, and occasionally accessible. In that framework, prayer becomes communication across space. The one prayer operates differently. It does not try to reach the source. It reveals that the source has never been absent. The sense of a separate self softens, and awareness rests in a deeper identity that is not divided. When separation dissolves, the problem loses its context. Problems depend on the belief that one is alone, unsupported, and responsible for sustaining life through effort. As that belief weakens, the emotional charge holding the problem together collapses. Fear cannot survive without separation. Anxiety requires distance between the one who needs help and the power that provides it. When that distance disappears, fear has nowhere to stand. This prayer is not a thought repeated to convince the mind of unity. It is an inward turning that allows awareness to sink beneath surface identity. In that turning, there is a quiet recognition of presence, not as something observed, but as what one is. This recognition does not feel dramatic, it feels natural, like remembering something obvious that was temporarily forgotten. In that remembering, life no longer feels like something happening to a separate individual. As separation dissolves, control relaxes. The need to manage outcomes fades because there is no longer a sense of standing apart from life. Action still occurs, but it flows rather than strains. Guidance appears without being requested. Support is felt rather than sought. What once felt like effort becomes responsiveness. The sense of unity also removes judgment from experience. Without separation, events are no longer labeled as threats or failures so quickly. They are seen as movements within a larger wholeness rather than interruptions to personal plans. This does not mean indifference, but perspective. The emotional intensity that once magnified problems softens, and clarity replaces reactivity. In this state, prayer is no longer something done at certain moments. It becomes continuous awareness. There is no need to turn toward the source because awareness is already resting there. Words may still arise, but they are expressions of gratitude or acknowledgement rather than requests born of lack. The deepest prayer becomes silent communion, a shared presence rather than a spoken appeal. As this way of prayer stabilizes, life is experienced less as a struggle for alignment and more as an unfolding of it. Problems arise and pass without defining identity. The individual no longer seeks to dissolve problems as much as they dissolve naturally in the absence of separation, leaving behind a quiet assurance that nothing essential has ever been missing and nothing real has ever been threatened. Conclusion: when all of this is gathered into a single understanding, it becomes clear that the prayer which dissolves every problem is not a technique to be practiced, but a consciousness to be lived. It is the quiet realization that nothing needs to be forced, fixed, or persuaded into harmony. Problems lose their power the moment awareness withdraws from fear, effort, and separation and rests in what is already whole. This prayer does not work by changing life from the outside, but by revealing that life has never been divided or deficient. As asking gives way to recognizing, striving gives way to stillness, and personal control yields to deeper awareness, the illusion that problems possess authority dissolves. What once appeared as conflict is seen as a misunderstanding of reality. In the absence of belief, separation and mental resistance, difficulties no longer have a foundation on which to stand. They may appear briefly, but they cannot dominate consciousness or define experience. The one prayer is therefore not spoken with the lips, but felt in awareness. It is the silent acknowledgement of unity, the surrender of false identity, and the recognition of an ever-present order that requires no assistance. In this recognition, peace is not postponed, solutions are not hunted, and fulfillment is not delayed. Life reveals itself as complete in each moment, and from that completeness, harmony expresses naturally.